Late last Saturday night, rabbinic colleagues here in the UK began circulating emails about 4 men who had been taken hostage at a Reform synagogue, Congregation Beit El, in Fort Worth, Texas, during a Shabbat morning service. It is hard to imagine the terrifying ordeal experienced by those 4, including their rabbi, Charlie Citron Walker, who after 11 hours of being held by a gunman, found an opportunity to hurl a chair at him, allowing his congregants and him to escape without being physically hurt. Congregation Beit Yisrael, Beit El, got the wrong name here, I think, is described as an intimate, vibrant, growing Reform Jewish congregation. On its website, it says that it has a lot to offer in terms of religious, social, and educational opportunities for the youngest to the oldest members. Although smaller than the LJS in numbers, it is, like us, a constituent member of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and a community that celebrates and mourns together, a community that supports and cares for one another, a community that is strengthened by the commitment of its members. And like us, as they state, they are a diverse community with families of all shapes and sizes, backgrounds, and levels of knowledge, but united by the Jewish understanding that we are all responsible for each other. On their website, just a few days afterwards, was a prayer written by a well-known American writer of liturgy and poetry, Alden Solovey, expressing gratitude that the hostages were rescued and praying for healing. And part of it goes like this: grant them shelter and solace, comfort and consolation, blessing and renewal, so that recovery can begin, leading to a complete restoration of heart, mind, and spirit. Release them from suffering, release them from trauma, return them in wholeness to life. A number of Solovey's poem prayers focus not only on healing and recovery for the victims and survivors of such attacks, including the attack at Pittsburgh, Synagogue in Pittsburgh, but on the perpetrators, their hatred and violence against Jews, the inquisitions and pogroms of old, the gas chambers and mass murders. Yet, he writes, we have survived. You who have persecuted us have failed. We have outlived you all. This week's parashah focuses on the covenantal relationship between God and Israel, the Jewish people. After slavery and the exodus from Egypt, the people arrive at Mount Sinai only 3 months into their 40-year journey. Here, the Israelites will be transformed from an oppressed rabble of slaves to a people bound to God by the covenant. It is in this prelude to the delivery of the 10 Commandments that God instructs Moses to say to the people of Israel, "Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. V'item li Segullah mikol ha'amim. Indeed, all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." What does God mean by calling the people a Segullah, a word which occurs several times in Tanakh, here in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, in the prophet Malachi, and in Psalm 135. The word Segullah translated as treasured possession, probably comes from a Hebrew root meaning to acquire property. In cognate languages, it means herds, or a share or portion. The author of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, refers to a lifetime of acquiring silver and gold, usgulat melachim v'hamadinot, treasures of kings and provinces. In Malachi, those who turn towards righteousness will become God's treasured possession. God will show tenderness towards them, as a father is tender towards the child who cares for him. And so it becomes clear that by calling Israel Segullah, a treasured possession, God implies that Israel is precious to him, like a cherished treasure, as Rashi says. Just as costly vessels and stones are precious and stored safely, so too Israel is cherished by God. But the phrase also raises a problem for us. Are we unique in being God's treasured possession? Did God choose us to be bound to him by this covenant? What about other peoples? One can see the rabbis wrestling with this word Segullah and the phrase that follows it, all the earth is mine. Surely if all the earth belongs to God, then all peoples stand in a unique and distinct and special relationship with the divine presence. The sages were divided broadly into two groups in their understanding of the election of the Jewish people. Some regarded Israel's chosenness as a cosmic act. In the rabbinic imagination, even before the creation of the world, Israel had been designated to be God's people. Rabbi Akiva and others taught that Israel were chosen to be the children of God, and that God gave Israel the Torah, the very instrument with which the world was created. The liturgy in our own prayer book reflects the relationship between God's love for Israel and God's choosing to give us the Torah. It is both cosmic and eternal. A word of warning: we should be careful not to accept the words of the sages as literal, but rather as imaginative and sometimes audacious ways of working out our purpose in the world and our relationship with God. The sages were all too conscious of the tension that existed between the reality of their status in the world, small in number, dispossessed from the countries in which they resided, without a national homeland, often persecuted and oppressed, and their self-perception as God's firstborn, beloved, a treasured possession. Spiritual consciousness was a long way from their lived experience. This doctrine of cosmic, eternal election was not accepted by all the sages. Others argued that it was not God who had chosen Israel, but rather Israel, we, who had chosen God. A midrash focuses on a verse in Psalms. Ki Yaakov bachar lo ya, Yisrael lisgulato. If you look at the structure of this verse, you'll see it's ambiguous. Does it mean for Jacob, meaning Israel here, the Jewish people, chose for himself God, Israel his treasured possession? Or does it mean for God chose Jacob for himself, Israel his treasured possession? Or perhaps we can interpret it in both ways. If we decline the doctrine that Israel has somehow arbitrarily been elected, then what are the consequences of being a people who have chosen God? The rabbis developed this idea to refer not only to the moment of accepting the Torah on Sinai, but throughout all time. God's reciprocity towards us, says Rabbi Judah, is conditional only on our choosing to be God's children. If you act like children, you are deemed children. If not, you are not accounted as children, says the Midrash. In other words, the special relationship of being God's Segullah, treasured possession, is dependent on how we conduct ourselves and our positive acceptance of our heritage. Of course, there is much, much more to say on the subject of chosenness and choosing. Like the rabbis of old, the editors of our Siddur wrestled with this word bachar, to choose, translating the first blessing before the reading of the Torah, which you just heard, not as who has chosen us from among all peoples, but you have called us to serve you by giving us the Torah, a subtle difference. And similarly, in the first paragraph of the Aleinu, the word bachar, he chose, was eliminated completely in our liberal Siddur and replaced with the concept of the Torah's universality. And this is the third way of understanding the concept of Am Segullah, God's treasured possession. The Torah is not exclusive to the Jewish people. Its teachings are for everyone, Jews, non-Jews, and those who choose to become Jewish alike. In spite of our history, as a people singled out for our differences, and often for persecution, we must not see the world in opposition to us, or us in opposition to the world. We must not be defined by the prejudices and ignorance of others, but by a common struggle against that which is unjust and cruel in the world. If the Torah has anything to teach us, it is about the holiness of relationships within our families, our community, between religions and nations, between those who are like us and those who are different. We are not a perfect people. We have our weaknesses, but we have also been given and have chosen the privilege of the heritage of Jacob, the teachings of the Torah that guide us in truth and wisdom, justice and ways of peace. May we be worthy of God's love and teaching and respond to the call to serve God with a whole heart. Amen.